We've delved into amoral civilizations and their collective consciousness before. Today marks episode 4 of our deep dive into the info from Oomoans.
I've been looking forward to this episode. The documents we're examining today completely reshape our understanding of how Earth has been handling extraterrestrial relations.
Before we dive in, remind our listeners what we covered last time about these civilizations.
Sure. We discussed two main groups, what the documents call the first and second dominions. But what we're covering today adds layers of complexity to that understanding.
Let's start with the basics. We're looking at documents that span from 1954 to the present day. What jumps out immediately?
Well, 1954 is our starting point, a pivotal year. The documents reveal an initial agreement that was established then. But here's where it gets interesting. It wasn't meant to last.
Not meant to last? That's intriguing. Can you elaborate?
By 1964, just 10 years later, the whole thing had fallen apart. And the reason is fascinating. Something the documents refer to as an Orion contingent intervention.
Hold on, Orion contingent? That's a new term for our listeners.
Exactly. And what's particularly striking is the specific involvement of two entities, Israel and the Vatican. According to these documents, they came forward with what's called proofs of antecedence.
This is getting complex already. Let's break this down for our listeners. What exactly are we talking about when we say proofs of antecedence?
The documents are actually quite specific about this. These visitors provided historical records of their interactions with Earth spanning millennia. And what they revealed was explosive, particularly regarding religious history.
In what way?
The documents detail that while records of Jesus are lacking, they had clear evidence about both Abraham and Moses. With Abraham, the records showed a context completely different from what's written in religious scriptures. As for Moses, they found what they describe as indisputable parallelism.
And this affected the negotiations?
Profoundly. These records were so damaging to religious authorities, particularly those who claimed to be receptacles of divine truth, that it created a serious diplomatic problem. Any agreement would have required these compromising archives to remain under absolute secrecy.
That's why it forced a renegotiation?
Exactly. When Israel and the Vatican became involved in 1964, armed with the knowledge of these records, it completely changed the diplomatic dynamics. This wasn't just about future relations, it was about controlling information about our past.
And this led to something new in 1966, correct?
Yes. And this is where things get really interesting. The 1966 agreement wasn't just another diplomatic document. It was a 120-year roadmap involving multiple species.
A 120-year roadmap? That's incredibly long-term thinking.
Exactly. Think about it. In 1966, we were still 3 years away from landing on the moon. Yet here was Earth, engaging in century-long diplomatic planning with non-terrestrial civilizations.
Speaking of Earth, who exactly was representing our planet in these negotiations?
That's one of the most fascinating aspects. The documents list 23 specific nations, and the selection process was remarkably methodical.
Before we get into those nations, what does this mean for our current situation? We're talking about agreements made in the 1960s that are still active today?
Absolutely. We're barely halfway through that 120-year timeline. And what's particularly relevant is how these agreements are still shaping current events, even though most people, including most political leaders, aren't aware of them.
So, 23 specific nations were chosen to represent Earth in these diplomatic agreements.
Yes, and this list is fascinating because it completely challenges what most people would expect.
Let's break it down. Who made the cut?
The documents list Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Colombia, Egypt, Ethiopia, France, Great Britain, India, Iraq, Iran, Mexico, Peru, Philippines, Poland, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ukraine, the United States, and South Africa.
That's quite a diverse group. What strikes me immediately is the inclusion of nations that weren't necessarily superpowers.
Exactly. And what's crucial here is understanding the three-stage selection process. The documents are very specific about this. The first stage was in 1945.
The end of World War II.
Precisely. These were the founding nations of the UN. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1954, the same year as the first agreement we discussed earlier, this list was refined based on what the documents call representative status.
Can you elaborate on what they mean by representative?
The documents suggest it wasn't just about military or economic power. They were looking for a cross-section of Earth's population, cultures, and interests. But there's a crucial detail here about legitimacy.
Legitimacy?
Yes. The documents specifically state that for any agreement to be valid, these countries must be represented by their leaders, legally and democratically elected by a majority vote of their populations.
That seems like a high bar to clear.
It is. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The Oomoans point out that many countries don't conform to this standard, particularly noting that electors who did not vote are not counted as opposing all proposed candidates.
This raises an important question about current validity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The Oomoans actually address this directly, stating that countries are undeniable entities, officially acknowledged, with clear boundaries and specific populations, but their main leaders no longer represent the real interests of their people, as they usually did when the agreements were signed.
That's a pretty stark assessment.
And it gets more complex. The documents reveal that real governance on these long-term topics is actually deported to defense and intelligence organizations.
Hold on. Are you saying political leaders aren't the ones handling these matters?
According to these documents, politicians are mainly dedicated to what they call the legislative formalization of guidelines that were, for the most part, decided before their appointment.
That would explain some of the disconnects we see in official statements about UFOs and actual events.
Exactly. Think about recent presidents: Obama, Trump, Biden. The documents suggest they're largely out of the loop on these matters.
This was during the height of the Cold War. Yet here, we have the US, Russia, and China all on the same list. Something clearly transcended normal geopolitics.
And that's what makes the next part of these documents so fascinating. While these nations were publicly locked in the Cold War, they were secretly participating in something far more significant.
Which brings us to what might be the most concrete example of this cooperation.
SERPO.
Before we dive into that, remind our listeners what the general understanding of SERPO has been up until now.
That's what makes this so remarkable. For decades, researchers believed this was about Zeta Reticuli. But what these documents reveal completely changes that narrative.
How deeply embedded was this Zeta Reticuli belief?
Incredibly deep. It became almost folklore in UFO research circles. But like we saw with the Cold War facade, the reality was much more complex. So what do these documents actually tell us about SERPO? The Oomoans tell a completely different story. First, SERPO isn't even in the Zeta Reticuli system. It's a colony orbiting HD 32923, a binary star system.
That's quite a revelation. What else did researchers get wrong?
The biggest misconception was about who controlled it. Everyone thought this was a gray alien installation, but according to these documents, it's actually under reptilian control. And this is where we meet the Tauri.
The Tauri?
Yes. Tauri. They're the actual inhabitants of SERPO, and their story reveals the true nature of reptilian expansion. According to these documents, the Tauri and reptilians were initially allies.
What changed?
Their relationship turned from cooperation to exploitation. When the Orion's original world was depleted after millennia of peaceful coexistence, the reptilians showed their true colors to the Tauris.
What happened to them?
The documents use very specific language here. They were seized forcefully and relocated to this colony. It's described as the smallest known colony among their territories.
But it has a special status, doesn't it?
Yes. It's their only colony allowed to deal with visitors and handle foreign diplomacy. The Tauri essentially became forced diplomatic intermediaries, but always under reptilian aka Orion overlords' control.
Let's talk about the demonstrations mentioned in the documents. There's something about gravitronic devices.
The documents describe live demonstrations to U.S. Air Force officials, showing how these devices could lift heavy loads and even be used as G laser beams for precise surgical cuts.
That's some advanced technology. Were these demonstrations part of the exchange program?
What's interesting is how the documents frame this. They mention these demonstrations happening on both sides, suggesting a mutual display of capabilities. But there's a warning tone throughout.
A warning tone?
Yes, like when they discuss the eerie, livid, and gaunt figures who used to dress in black suits. The documents describe them as bio-adapted to speak and interact moderately like humans. but emphasize they had orders to do no harm.
This brings up something crucial about the men in black phenomenon. The documents seem to connect it directly to this SERPO situation.
They do, and they offer a very different perspective than what we typically hear. These figures are described as a subcategory of the reptiloid people, of the sterile lower rank.
Let's pause there for a moment. Are we saying the men in black phenomenon and SERPO are directly connected to what you earlier called the First Dominion?
According to these documents, yes. And this reveals something crucial about the nature of these diplomatic relations. They're far more complex and interconnected than anyone realized. What's fascinating is how specific these documents are about which nations are leading this effort towards a specific disclosure narrative.
3 nations in particular, right?
Exactly. Australia, Brazil, and Russia. But what's crucial to understand is why these particular nations and why now.
The timing does seem significant.
It ties directly back to what we discussed earlier about the 1966 agreement. Remember, we're looking at a 120-year timeline, so we're just about halfway through.
That's an interesting point about timing. The documents mention economic concerns specifically regarding disclosure. Can we explore that?
This is where things get particularly serious. The documents outline several potential consequences of improper disclosure. They specifically warn that it could act as a catalyst leading to chaos.
What kind of chaos are we talking about?
The documents are quite specific. First, they warn about a total collapse of markets due to loss of confidence in major nation governments. But there's more to it.
Go on.
They predict that all basic social and economic problems would essentially explode. Think about it. Sudden confirmation of these agreements would raise serious questions about government legitimacy.
The documents also mention religious implications.
Yes, there's a specific warning about religious fanatics potentially using disclosure as a pretext to indoctrinate new followers against what they'd call infidels who made pacts with satanic creatures.
That's quite stark language.
And what's particularly interesting is how they compare this potential chaos to another crisis they saw coming.
Which was?
The documents specifically mention an impending banking crisis. They suggested that the chaos from uncontrolled disclosure could be even worse than that.
This explains why they propose such a careful approach to disclosure, doesn't it?
Exactly. The documents outline a very specific hierarchy for information release. It's fascinating how detailed this process is.
Can you walk us through that hierarchy?
They start with main intelligence agencies, then move to ministries of defense and presidencies of major nations. From there, it goes to state and territorial officers, then to the press, and finally to the general public. And until then, exactly what we've seen unfolding.
Almost like a controlled cascade of information?
Precisely. And look at recent events. We're seeing exactly this pattern playing out. Intelligence agencies are increasingly open about UFO phenomena. Military organizations are releasing footage.
This raises an interesting question about the role of these 3 nations, Australia, Brazil, and Russia. Why them specifically?
The documents suggest something fascinating about their position. They say these nations envision more and more seriously a formal disclosure. But notice what's missing from that list.
What's missing?
Traditional Western powers. No United States. No United Kingdom. No France. This suggests a significant shift in the global dynamics of this issue.
So there is intelligence agencies managing these relationships, namely CIA, Mossad, and even a weirder one, that is the Vatican itself. This brings us to something fascinating in the documents about political leadership.
Yes, and this might be one of the most revealing aspects. The documents explicitly state that governance on these long-term topics is deported to defense and intelligence organizations.
That's quite a statement. What exactly does that mean in practice?
According to these documents, politicians, even presidents, are mainly there to formalize decisions that were made before they even took office. The real coordination happens through organizations with more lasting and competent staff.
That raises questions about democratic oversight, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it ties directly to those conditions we discussed earlier about legitimate representation. Remember how the documents specified that countries must be represented by their leaders legally and democratically elected?
But if the real decisions are made by intelligence agencies?
Exactly. The documents actually address this contradiction. They note that current leaders no longer represent the real interests of their people, as they usually did when the agreements were signed.
Let's talk about the warning aspects. The documents mention something about bearers of false gifts.
This is fascinating because it connects to a specific crop circle that appeared in Crabwood. The documents validate that these crop circles are indeed messages, mostly traced by what they call Wemi travelers foreign to your planet. This refers to a more advanced life form not from Earth. The term extraterrestrial might be a bit human-centric.
Can you elaborate on that Crabwood message?
It said, "Beware of bearers of false gifts and their broken promises." The documents suggest this was a direct warning about certain agreements being negotiated with Earth powers.
The message appeared in a stunning crop circle formation at Crabwood in 2002. Can you describe what it looked like?
The formation in the middle of a field depicted a gray alien face in remarkable detail, complete with large eyes containing distinct pupils, with the constellation of Orion's belt visible in the background, seemingly a deliberate reference to the two dominions the Oomoans have warned us about. Next to this image was a disk containing binary code that, when decoded, revealed that warning message. What's particularly interesting is that this appeared just 1 year before the Oomoans would resume their communications in 2003.
So this warning about false gifts and broken promises came with quite specific imagery. This connects to what you mentioned earlier about the amoral races.
Yes, and here's where it gets particularly concerning. The documents suggest these races are actively pushing for what they call a notorious new world order.
What's their motivation?
According to these sources, they're actually hoping for a socio-economic collapse that would lead to the disappearance of nations in favor of this new order controlled by what the documents call elite psychopaths.
That's quite an accusation. How do the intelligence agencies fit into this?
The documents suggest they're walking a fine line. They're aware of these manipulation attempts. That's why they're pushing for this carefully managed disclosure process.
Let's talk about timing. The documents mention urgency about disclosure. Why?
They specifically state that if disclosure has to happen, it needs to be released soon and very progressively. There's a sense that time is running out.
How does this tie into the crop circle phenomenon you mentioned?
The Oomoans actually explain this. They say these signs are meant to provoke a progressive awareness of the extraterrestrial reality through a legitimate questioning of their origin.
But there's a warning attached to that too, isn't there?
Yes, and it's quite specific. The documents warn about the risk of global agreements being signed without proper representation. They specifically point to Article 12 of the UN Charter, mentioning threat to self-determination.
What all this means for the immediate future. Looking at these documents, what should people be watching for?
What's particularly interesting is how the documents describe certain technological demonstrations. They mention gravitronic devices that can lift heavy loads and focus as G-laser beams.
Are you suggesting we might see public demonstrations of this technology?
The documents actually indicate that some of these demonstrations have already occurred, specifically to U.S. Air Force officials. But what's crucial is understanding the context of these displays.
What do you mean?
They're described as live demonstrations from both sides. This suggests a kind of technological exchange program, but one that might be more visible in coming years.
Let's talk about the three nations we mentioned earlier: Australia, Brazil, and Russia. What should we be watching for there?
The documents suggest these nations are moving more and more seriously toward formal disclosure. What's fascinating is the time frame they're working with.
Is this connected to that 120-year agreement timeline?
Exactly. We're at a crucial midpoint now. But there's something else significant about these three nations.
What's that?
They represent three different spheres of influence. Australia with its Western alignments, Brazil representing South America, and Russia with its own geopolitical sphere. This isn't random.
The documents also mention something about validation requirements for future agreements?
Yes. And this is crucial for understanding what's coming. They specify that no formal agreement with an institution not representative of the Oyaga A nations would be considered valid.
Oyaga being Earth, correct?
Right. And here's where it gets interesting regarding current events. The documents warn about attempts to circumvent proper representation through what they call a notorious new world order.
This connects to those economic warnings we discussed earlier?
Precisely. They're describing a potential scenario where economic collapse could be used to force through agreements without proper planetary representation.
Let's talk about the time frame. How imminent are these developments?
The documents are actually very specific about this. There's a crucial deadline approaching, July 2026. According to these sources, a votation will take place among NATO countries. And per treaty requirements, some form of disclosure must occur before this deadline.
That's quite specific. Why 2026?
The timing appears linked to these long-standing agreements we discussed earlier. The documents indicate this deadline isn't arbitrary. It's part of the treaty requirements that were established decades ago, signed in 1966.
And how does this affect the disclosure process?
The documents point to a crucial deadline in July 2026, when a votation will take place among NATO countries. But there's something disturbing about the lead-up to this date.
What do you mean?
According to these documents, certain amoral races are actively seeking an agreement that would unite all countries under what they call a notorious new world order. They're actually counting on social and economic instability.
Are you saying the collapse isn't something to be prevented?
Exactly. The documents suggest that economic collapse and social instability could be engineered specifically to facilitate these agreements. The disclosure process itself might be used as a catalyst for this upheaval.
So all these recent UFO disclosures, government task forces, official investigations,
might not be as benevolent as they appear. The Oomoans suggest we need to be very careful about distinguishing between genuine disclosure and what they call false gifts and broken promises.
what specific signs should our listeners watch for in the coming months?
The document suggests several key indicators: increased openness from intelligence agencies, coordinated releases of information across multiple countries, and particularly any joint statements from Australia, Brazil, or Russia regarding unusual phenomena.
As we wrap up this extensive analysis, what's your final take on these documents and their implications?
What's most striking is how much of what they describe is already happening. The careful release of information, the involvement of specific agencies, the economic concerns. It's all playing out exactly as outlined.
And the warnings?
They seem more relevant than ever. The emphasis on proper representation, the concerns about hasty agreements, the need for careful disclosure. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're active challenges we're facing right now.
Thank you for joining us for this podcast series. We'll continue monitoring these developments and bring you updates on the next episodes.